perfect example would be the case of that guy who died in Minneapolis. The black guy who died of probably a drug overdose. George Floyd. George Floyd. Back a couple of years ago, George Floyd, a lifelong career criminal, basically died of a drug overdose while in police custody, and that launched the entire global Black Lives Matter movement. In other words, it was claimed he'd been murdered by the police, even though the evidence was clearly he died of a drug overdose. I mean, there were huge marches everywhere around the United States and even many parts of Europe. I mean, it caused almost an ideological revolution, like a cultural revolution with our institutions. And we're talking about one career criminal who died of a drug overdose. Now we're talking about probably close to 30,000 innocent civilians deliberately killed by massive bombardments of missiles and bombs. And you're not allowed to protest any of that, which I think is just utterly absurd. I mean, the fact that universities are preventing these protests taking place, and in Europe, for example, in some of the European countries, pro-Palestinian protests have been declared illegal. In other words, you're not allowed to march in favor of these people being slaughtered. I mean, it's a gigantic slaughter. And I mean, take, for example, what happened in the Balkans during the Balkan Wars. You had a bitter conflict between Serbs, Bosnian Muslims, and Croatians. And there were allegations that the Serbs were engaged in ethnic cleansing and some atrocities. I mean, certainly a lot of people died in those wars, but it was mostly fought by militias on all sides. And because of the allegations of Serb ethnic cleansing or bombing helpless cities, I mean, it caused basically NATO to attack Serbia. And, the leaders of Serbia then were dragged off to The Hague and ended up ending their lives in prison. They were prosecuted for war crimes. I mean, what's going on in Gaza is so massively worse than any of that, and visited on absolutely helpless civilians. I mean, churches destroyed, hospitals destroyed, all of that. And none of the European countries are intervening. None of the West is intervening. And if anything, in many cases, they're banning protests against these atrocities. So, I mean, it's really an absolutely absurd situation. And I think, in this particular case, I mean, those elements of the left and also in some cases of the right who are outraged by this are 100% correct. And, it's including some very reputable people, like, for example, John Mearsheimer, Jeffrey Sachs, Ray McGovern. I mean, people basically who are very highly regarded, mainstream academics, some of the topmost academics in the United States. And also, I mean, people basically who have, a strong reputation, national security leaders. I mean, this is just utterly outrageous. And at some point, I think there may be a collapse in support for these ridiculous policies.